Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Banned Book Club. Today's episode is a very, very special one for our series where we explore powerful stories that have faced challenges and we're going to discuss why they continue to matter. Today, I'm especially honored to be joined by the author of Sold, the one and only Patricia McCormick, whose work has sparked important conversations across classrooms, libraries, and communities all around the world. Those of you who have listened to the episode that I released before may know about this. Sold tells the story of Lakshmi, a young girl who was trafficked into sexual slavery from her rural village in Nepal all the way to the red light district of Calcutta in India. It's a book that has opened readers' eyes all around the world to the realities of human trafficking, exploitation, modern day slavery, and the way that migration play a role in keeping people in vulnerable situations. At the same time, while this book is very significant and providing this insight, it has also been consistently challenged in many forms due to its difficult subject matter. So today, Patricia and I will talk about what inspired her to write Sold, the research and the real life stories behind it. So we'll start off talking about the background, how she got into this research, what made her interested in producing it in the first place, and then enjoy a larger conversation around censorship, storytelling, and why confronting hard truths can be so important. So, Patricia, thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to have you.
Thanks. And I just want to express my appreciation for you doing this work. I think that, people misunderstand what it means to have a book be banned or challenged. We'll talk about that some more, but just the idea that you and your group are bringing attention to my book and the books that are being challenged, it gives us a lifeline. It keeps us from, kind of sputtering out and dying.
Well, thank you so much again for agreeing to discuss it. I think, the fact that you're here speaking about it, continuing to advocate for those stories is equally, if not more important. And I know me and everyone who's a part of this book club and who's a reader of this book has definitely appreciated this story. Before we jump into this book itself, I would just love to learn a little bit more about how you came to the idea to write a book on such a heavy topic. So, the first question I want to have to kind of start us off is, what was your understanding of human trafficking, modern slavery, and exploitation before you started writing this novel? What got you interested in it?
Believe it or not, I did the research for this book more than 20 years ago. And at the time, I was not aware that there was such a thing as trafficking. And I met a young man who was a photographer, and he was sneaking into the brothels to document the presence of young girls there. And when he told me about trafficking, I was like, wait, this is happening now? I knew nothing about trafficking. And
Mhm.
so I instantly thought somebody needs to tell this story from the girl's point of view, that there are lots of great pieces of journalism about trafficking as an issue. But I think there's a way in which we read these big issue stories, they harden our hearts. They make us feel like the world is kind of an overwhelmingly difficult and daunting place to manage. But if you read the story of one person, and Lakshmi is a fictional person, she's based on a little bit from this person I interviewed, a little bit from that one. But I think when you connect with an individual, it opens your heart and makes you feel as though you can't look away anymore.
Of course, of course. And as you mentioned, Lakshmi is a fictional character, but I want to hear a little bit more later on, maybe about kind of the different stories that you put together to create her character. She's a character that I mean, is incredibly inspiring, incredibly hopeful in such difficult circumstances, and I think also in circumstances that many people feel that they would just give up. I mean, I hear a lot working in the sector when I talk to people about the work, they say, "Oh my gosh, I could never do that. I could never survive that." And I always try to remind people that you don't really understand the resilience that you have until you're in those positions. And I think Lakshmi's character is a perfect example of that. With the research that you've done, how did that go? Like, how did you kind of get into these spaces? How did you build trust with, I mean, you mentioned the photographer, but what about the women that were working there? I believe you worked with different charities as well that kind of took you into these spaces. Could you walk me through a little bit of that?
It was the NGOs that really opened the door for me. And when I started telling people that I wanted to write a book about trafficking, one person connected me to another, to another. It was like this bucket brigade who really wanted to be helpful and could see why a fictional story or a novel for young readers could have a big impact. So people opened their arms to me, and before I knew it, I had a plane ticket and I had appointments in India and Nepal on the other side of the world. I am not a foreign correspondent. I'm not somebody who is accustomed to, I am a reporter, but not that level of kind of adventure. And I think that's probably good because I think if I had known what I was getting into, I would have blanched. I might have stopped. So I was very lucky. And I think the countries that I chose, India and Nepal, were because those countries had already created an infrastructure to fight trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
As you know more than anybody, Jenna, it happens all over the world. But those two countries were willing to kind of share their dirty laundry in a way that other countries would not be. And
Right.
so it took a lot of integrity and it took a lot of generosity for those organizations to let me in.
Right. Oh, I could imagine. And I guess a kind of a question that brings up for me is why do you feel like countries like Nepal and India were more willing to discuss these aspects of I don't want to say the culture, but these terrible atrocities that were happening there where other places tend to want to cover them up?
That is a question that I really cannot answer. I
Hmm.
think that, there's a long-standing tradition in India of uplift
Hmm.
by members of the more privileged classes. In particular, this work was done by well-educated women in India, who many of them had jobs, and this was like a social service commitment that they did on the side. And I can't explain why they were so open. I also think that India and Nepal were advantageous for me because English being spoken
Right.
in India,
Hmm.
that for me to try to penetrate in its Eastern Bloc Soviet, the former Soviet countries, or in Latin America would have been much more challenging. And I think there's a very heavy presence of organized crime in all of these places,
Hmm.
but the Soviet and Latin American crime syndicates are way more punishing, I think.
What safeguarding concerns were you kind of, maybe you knew that you had to be aware of going into it? I mean, as a researcher, I'm sure you're very well versed on the ethics of interviews and working with people that are vulnerable. Were there any that surprised you or came up that were particularly challenging?
That's a really great question. There was such a willingness on the part of the young women that I interviewed to be helpful.
Hmm.
And yes, there was definitely a language barrier. I had a really wonderful interpreter who helped me along the way. I've done a lot of interviews with people who've experienced trauma, so I know about, building trust and building the sets of questions gently, but also as a reporter and writer, you know that it's the details that are going to really make the story hit
Hmm.
home for people. And so you have to move very carefully to get traumatized people, in this case, these young women, to go back over the most horrific, difficult moments in their lives without re-traumatizing them. I'd constantly ask for consent. Can we go here? Can we ask this? Can we get that? And one of the women that I interviewed just stared off into space like a robot the whole time. That was the only way she could protect herself. The
Hmm.
other woman sort of giggled a lot. And obviously, that was just her response to the embarrassment
Hmm.
that she felt. But they are not from a culture of psychotherapy. It's not as though these are young women who are accustomed to telling their stories. In fact, they don't tell their stories to each other. When they have been rescued, or at least this is the level of work that was being done back when I did my research, they're rescued, they get a health check, and they quickly get trained for with job skills so that they would never have to be trafficked again or that they be an economically independent again.
Hmm.
But they hadn't shared their stories very often, so they were kind of sealed up tight inside them. And their motivation for doing it really wasn't about self-healing. It was much more about helping somebody else on down the line.
Wow. So it's that community aspect of I wasn't able to be protected, so I want to put my story forward to protect other people.
Exactly.
That's really, I mean, that's really moving, to be honest, to hear. And I think that a lot of women that are face sexual exploitation, sexual violence, they really feel that way when they come forward with their stories. I think, I don't think it's any secret that the criminal justice system does not always stand by women that are in these positions. I think that can be seen in a lot of different contexts. And I find that women that do bring their stories forward and try to find justice are doing it from that community protection aspect. They're hoping that by sharing this, maybe it won't happen to somebody else, or they're hoping that it won't happen to somebody else.
Do you know what else I wanted to add, Jenna? I also, at a certain point, told the women about my own experiences as a survivor of sexual harm as a child,
Hmm.
just as a way to create that bridge and that kind of commonality and that kind of sense. I understand where you're coming from. The particulars of my story are not the same as yours. The shock that they registered when I said, yes, me too, was really something. I think there was a way in which they made the assumption that, a white woman from, a more affluent society wouldn't experience such harm. But there's sadly this great commonality, this great sisterhood.
Did you find it difficult to engage with these spaces, maybe with your own experience? I mean, also, you're seeing some really, really horrific things happening, like to adults, to children. What difficulties did you find engaging in that space?
So I didn't have a lot of difficulty gaining their trust. I spent days and days and days just hanging out so that they would see that I wasn't somebody who's just going to pop in and pop out again. I think the difficulty for me was more that I didn't protect myself better, that I went into this idea, I went in with the idea I'm going to write a story about a girl who outwits the traffickers. Well,
Wow.
okay, that is not possible. Once I got there, I realized I had to write the story all the way deep into the most ugly heart of it. And seeing the conditions, seeing these young girls. I saw a little 11-year-old girl who'd been trafficked and was just lying in a fetal position as she had been for months. And that just broke my heart. Taking in all the information, there's kind of like a schizophrenic quality to it. Like as a journalist, as you're taking your notes, okay, this is good. This is going to make it into the book. But there's a part of you that's like, oh my God, this is awful. I can't bear to hold this information.
Right.
So you get this kind of, two parts to you at once. But I kept my act together. I was also traveling by myself. I brought no protection. I brought no friends. But at the end of the day, I'd call home and I didn't want to tell my family about either the physical danger or the emotional difficulties that I'd encountered because they would be worried. So I really kept it all bottled up until after the trip. And I got home and it was Christmas time and everybody here was shopping and spending money on wrapping paper. And I just fell into a terrible depression. What fixed it for me was I went there to be part of the solution. And so the only way I could gain power over all of that was to start writing. And once I started writing, the depression lifted. But I felt so flattened by everything I'd seen.
Of course.
But once you start writing, you know you're on the path toward being part of the solution or part of raising awareness, and then you're okay.
Were there any stories or aspects, and feel free to share them or not share them, that, where it felt like, oh, this is something I don't want to include in this book? Like, was there kind of a point where you felt like maybe this goes too deep or this is too heavy? I mean, I feel like that sometimes in my work when I am interviewing with clients and they share things and people ask, oh, how was your day? I mean, notwithstanding all the confidentiality stuff, when you're talking to people, I'm sometimes aware like, okay, this is what I hear on the day to day. It's heavy, yes, but to somebody who's not aware, who maybe has never heard of debt bondage, having to break that down, the situations of why somebody's in debt bondage. I mean, that can send somebody into their own depression if they're not equipped with the awareness about it. I think especially with trafficking and stuff, there's very, very different perceptions of what sex trafficking is, I think, in different countries, who the victims are, why they're
Mhm.
victimized, different things like that. So how did you, I guess, decide what you wanted to leave in? Were there things that you decided you wanted to take out, or was it just kind of everything?
I wanted to create a character who had a lot of spunk and buoyancy and curiosity and hope. So I had to borrow little stories from the girls before they'd been trafficked, and then borrowed a little bit from this one and a little bit from that one to create this composite character. I wouldn't say there's necessarily anything I left out. I did have an experience in one of the brothels where during the day, I'd gone in during the day to do the interviews because at night the customers would be there and that wouldn't be possible for me to have access. But during the middle of the afternoon, I was interviewing a woman, and right down the hall, if I could even call it a hallway, a man who I don't know if he was a pimp or a customer started beating a woman. And
Oh,
I jumped up to intervene, and my translator slash she was worked with an NGO who helped the women said, "You cannot get involved in that. You'll get hurt. I'll get hurt. We won't be able to go back here to do our work anymore. It's possible that if you, as a white woman, try to intervene, the man will beat her even more severely."
right, right.
So I sat there and did not intervene. And I remember looking down at my notebook, and I wasn't aware that I was crying, but there like the words were running off the tablet because the tears were dropping onto my notebook.
Hmm.
It felt like it lasted forever. It didn't. Another man came along and beat up the first man, and it was over in no time. But it was one of these, it puts a moral injury on you kind of for the rest of your life that you were present when somebody else was being brutalized and you didn't do anything. I tried to tell myself I'm doing the bigger thing. I'm taking the story out into the world, but you still never get over something like that.
No, of course. I mean, I couldn't even imagine seeing something like that and the trauma that you would carry. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about the movie as well. So, I watched it. It was phenomenal. I guess how involved were you in that process?
The people who did the movie did it with their own, pretty much their own funding because it wasn't the kind of movie that a studio was going to back because it was not going to be a moneymaker. So the fact that David Arquette and Emma Thompson was one of the producers and Gillian Anderson starred in the film for almost no money, they did it because they wanted to be part of building awareness. So that was extraordinary. Just like the filmmakers did it um, to raise awareness in a way that a book can't do. A movie, gets a much broader circulation, is much, in some ways, easier for people to take in.
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
sit in a movie theater for 2 hours, an hour and a half, and it comes at you. Whereas with a book, you have to really choose to keep going when it's difficult. I didn't have they invited me to be involved, but the truth is, I don't know anything about movies except that I like them. It
Yeah.
would be like somebody telling me how to write my book. And so I basically gave them free rein to interpret what I had done in their own way. And so there's a chase scene in the movie, and Lakshmi escapes out the window. That's not too likely to have happened in the real world, but the conventions of movie making require that.
Right. I could understand that. No, that totally makes sense. But I mean, I liked the movie. I loved your book. I think it's interesting you say that the movie has more reach than the book because I think your book is quite renowned and I think it's gotten a lot of that. I mean, that's why it's so challenged. We'll get into that later as well. I know but Pan America had said in 2025 it was the third most challenged books in schools, which is just crazy to me. Kind of before we jump into the themes of the book, the different questions there, and then the ban. The last question I have for you is about the hidden nature of trafficking. So I think people typically consider trafficking to be kind of a hidden crime, swept under the rug. People don't really see it, or if they see it, they have a very specific idea of that.
I only really have expertise in terms of India and Nepal,
Mhm.
and it is both hidden and not.
Okay.
I think a lot of the families in Nepal now understand that when their kids go away for these good jobs that are almost too good to be true, that they are being sold.
Mhm.
But that they are so desperate, they are so poor, that they tell themselves that it's really going to be okay. But you can look in the community, it's as it is in the book. If there's a house that has a tin roof, or there's a house that has a generator, likely somebody in that family is either working abroad or has been trafficked.
Wow.
Um,
I guess I said this was the last, but this brought me to another question I had. So, kind of with the beginning story of Lakshmi, which was a little bit different in the movie than in the book, they talked a lot about the stepfather's gambling addiction, maybe a drinking addiction as well. And that was a lot of where the money would go. He got the bike, he lost the bike, and eventually that was kind of it appears the driver as to why Lakshmi ended up being in that situation where she was, sold into slavery as a maid. Was that a story that you had heard often? What was your experience listening to the introduction or the beginnings of the women that ended up in these situations?
Most of the women that I interviewed were trafficked, were sold by family members or by a boyfriend.
Wow.
And there's that level of trust that you have with a family member who says, I'm going to get you a good job, or I'm going to take you to meet my auntie. And there's a naivete because the girls are very unworldly.
Hmm.
They come from these little villages. There's no TV or internet or radio or TV or any of the things that would make them aware of the possibility that there are people out there that mean them ill. It's mostly family members, unfortunately. And
Wow.
you know, when you think of things that are hidden, not hidden, Jeffrey Epstein promised those girls modeling jobs and big glamorous jobs in the United States. Some of the girls that he brought from Eastern Europe, some of the younger girls from Florida and from the United States, the same thing. And they are unworldly and they are usually already traumatized in some way
Hmm.
and very, very vulnerable. You know, it's not like the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world go after the valedictorians in the class. They go after the kids who are already at risk.
Actually, one of my mentors, he coined this term, the pool of availability, and it refers to kind of these spaces where recruiters know there are vulnerable people. So, in the context of my work, it's the pupil referral unit. So, the alternative learning spaces where kids that maybe have learning disabilities don't have a lot of support and need that extra support. Traffickers
Mhm.
know that there will be people there that are vulnerable, and they intentionally go there offering the dream, oh, if you work with us and you
Mhm.
can buy 1,000-pound shoes, you can buy a 400-pound shirt, and they sell this lifestyle and they portray that lifestyle. And, people
Mhm.
that don't have support, people that have family trauma, I think family trauma is a huge push factor to somebody entering this lifestyle, or at least,
Yeah.
starting to accept that this is kind of a normal
Mhm.
environment or something like that. I mean, I hate to say it doesn't surprise me to hear that about the family aspect of it, but I think unfortunately it's so common, and people know that people from these environments are more easily exploited.
Do you know your other point too about things being hidden? I think we assume that traffickers are going to be like the people. I've only watched one of the Liam Neeson films, but that it's going to be some thug who hits you over the head or steals you at the airport. Do you know there are women who do the trafficking because they're finding their own replacements? That's how they get free later on. Or in the bus stations here in the United States, for instance, or truck stops there'll be a young man who looks like a normal kid and he'll see a girl who's a runaway and she's cold and she's hungry and he goes over and says, hey, do you want my jacket or can I buy you a piece of pizza? And so this isn't like a trafficker that they're not expecting, you know, a fellow teenager
Got
to
a
be
bag
part of
over
that
your head
network.
and forcing you in the car. Yeah.
Right.
It's that befriending element of it. It's offering a better opportunity than the one that someone's currently in. And I think most people, if they're in a bad situation, they want to do something to get out of it. And I think
Yeah.
to a larger degree, that's a lot of what happens here is people, they want something better. They're hoping for something better. I mean, I was very emotional every time Lakshmi in the book would reference, a tin roof. She just wants to bring her family a tin roof. Like she was doing what she was doing, even in the worst conditions, with the intention that at some point she's going to still be able to get out, provide for her family, and that's why
Yeah.
all of this was going to be worth it. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of people don't always pick up on that aspect of it, and I unfortunately think that's part of why it stays so hidden, actually, because people don't see that it's in. Maybe they don't see. I think sometimes people don't want to see because it's so terrible, but it really is in plain sight, I think, once you start picking up the cues and become
Yeah.
informed about it.
I also think that some of the kids in the United States who've been trafficked don't present as victims. they look pretty tough, and they've made themselves tough as a result of what they've gone through. And for years, police treated women who were sex workers as criminals, when in fact, especially if they're young, they're the victims, which,
Yeah.
we know now, but it wasn't always that way.
No, of course. I mean, even sometimes when I'm going through old academia, they refer to things like child sex work. Like, what is child sex work? That's trafficking, that's exploitation. And the fact that that's even
Yeah.
a more relatively new term. I don't want to say new, I mean, in the last 30,
Yeah.
40 years, but I mean,
Yeah.
I just still, it took too long to pick up on that. And I think we're still seeing kind of the ripple effects of that. And I mean, in places like the US, where you think that there is an awareness of this, there is a strong sense of justice and democracy, vulnerable youth will always still fall through the cracks with that, let alone in places like India or Nepal, where there is a strong rule of law, but not in all places, not in all places. And
Yeah.
I think when you add the corruption element to things, which, in the
Mhm.
book we saw that with the policemen taking the bribes to not raid the brothels, I think that further just shows that the systems are not really helping the women and girls the way that they're supposed to.
And as you know, as an expert in migration, whenever there's a natural disaster and kids are separated from their parents, traffickers swoop right in.
Right, right, exactly. I mean, yeah, near the border as well, when there's the family separation, youth that are put into foster care when families are divided. That was actually part of one of the programs we worked in. It was a program for minor victims of labor trafficking, and it was for
Mhm.
youth that were, passed on or supposed to have been passed on to safe family members, but it turns
Yeah.
out those family members weren't entirely safe. Even the ones that
Mhm.
were, they maybe didn't have the awareness. They weren't sta in a stable situation where they could really advocate or protect their youth, and then put on the other factors of immigration, vulnerability. Maybe there's people in the house that are not documented or properly documented. Those all create additional barriers to getting help. I mean, kind of like with Lakshmi, she, was there, she didn't speak the language, she had to learn it piece by piece with the boy that she met in the brothel. And all those factors, I think you illustrated it kind of through her character development, the different vulnerabilities that kept her trapped. I guess we've already kind of got into the storyline a little bit, but just to kind of fully jump in, I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you about a metaphor that specifically stood out to me about goats. It was women and girls are like goats. They're good for making milk, but you shouldn't cry when it's time to make stew. I
Mhm.
wonder what inspired that, if that was something that just came to you, if there was a specific example or a story that you felt kind of shaped that metaphor for you.
Do you know, there wasn't a specific story. It's just that in Nepal, I would see them sort of trotting around and being treated like pets and then being served goat stew. And I thought, okay, that's not dissimilar to what happens to the girls. The other thing is about the way the women are treated when they menstruate. They are so shut away, as if they are dirty
Mhm.
and they're going to bring bad luck on the rest of the house. There's such a misunderstanding. Or the idea, like one of the men that I interviewed in prison, in a jail in Kathmandu, he said he sold his girlfriend, and all the men in the prison were sitting in on my interview with him, and they all laughed. Oh, they thought that was so funny. I said, well, why? Why did you sell her? And he said, well, I wanted a motorcycle. And to him, it was like he had a girlfriend, he wanted a motorcycle, they were interchangeable.
hmm Wow. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a unfortunate perfect illustration of exactly what you're talking about, the women being viewed as objects. And yeah, I found that metaphor deeply disturbing and also illuminating at the same time because I think it just kind of captures it perfectly. I mean, even the idea of women be raising babies, giving milk, it's providing that service for men. But then when they have
Mhm.
to go or they have to, oh, they're not relevant, there's something better that comes along. We're hungry, it's time to eat. They're the first things that are disposable. Do you find that there's any kind of metaphor within Western culture that you think would be comparable to something like that?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head in Western culture. And yet, when I talk and I go to schools, a lot of the times I talk to kids about trafficking and talk about some of the lyrics in certain songs that are so demeaning to women and try to explain that if you spend your 99 cents or you buy that on iTunes, whatever, you are participating in the degradation of women so that there's a chain there that you can stop. You can refuse to be part of that where people make money off the degradation of women.
Totally, totally. And I think that's such a good point. I think in hip hop rap culture, I mean, I have to admit I'm a fan of a lot of hip hop and rap, but I think also you have to listen to it very critically to understand what you're consuming. And with how mainstream it is, I think people, especially young boys, they hear this music. I mean, young women too, but it affects them differently. I think young boys, when they hear that, they don't necessarily realize the misogynistic culture that they're engaging with because they're so young. They maybe don't even consider those dynamics yet. But the older that you get, the more you hear that language, the more you start to use that language. It starts out maybe as a joke and then it becomes something more serious. And then I think people end up being perpetrators of this misogynistic culture. I mean, maybe not in such an aggressive way as selling their girlfriend for a motorcycle, but by using vulgar language, the locker room talk, all of those types of things that kind of keeps enabling that culture. I think that's a really, really good example, actually, of talking about it with rap music. And then with women, women, they internalize it in a different way. They hear people saying it, they listen to it, they think, oh, if I'm referred to like this with this language or this language, it's actually a compliment. And it turns derogatory. I mean, I could argue it's always been derogatory, but I think that line can get crossed very, very quickly.
Agreed, totally.
I guess we kind of mentioned it as well with the brothels, and you had mentioned women being traffickers to remove themselves from that position. I could imagine to the average reader, they imagine the pimps as the big guys with the chains or, the drug dealer on the corner or different things like that. What was your experience seeing women working in the brothels and kind of how did that go into creating Mumtaz's character?
I think that I decided with Mumtaz's character that as cruel as she was, I thought it was important that it be a woman who was in charge of the brothel, both to have this kind of weird maternal role that she plays, as well as this incredibly exploitive role that she plays in her cruelty. I thought it was important to have a woman be in that position because that's the truth of how the brothels typically are organized, that they are women who have kind of like worked their way up, so to speak. But also, I feel like it was important to think about, well, how did she get to be that way? And likely she has her own trauma history. And just because she quote unquote worked her way up doesn't mean that it was trauma free. Do you
No.
know, that doesn't mean that this is a good situation for her. But I think we're surprised when women are involved in preying on other women.
Hmm.
But that is what poverty will do to you. That is what corruption and oppression will do to you. It strips you of your integrity and it warps your moral compass. It just brings you down to a low that you didn't know you were capable of.
How did you see kind of that experience happening? Because I know at the beginning of the book, there's a woman at the festival, the beautiful woman that Lakshmi,
Right.
wants to go with, who said you can
Yeah.
be a maid, work in the city. That's a different character from Mumtaz, who's relatively
Mhm.
kind of situated in the brothel, abusing the
Mhm.
women, handling the customers, the finances. I mean, her debt bondage is to Mumtaz. It's not to the other men that brought her across the border. And I mean, we can understand how it can transfer, how maybe lots of it doesn't even exist and is fictionalized to keep the women in that position. But yeah, like how did you kind of see women trafficking other women?
It wasn't something that I literally saw. It was more
Okay.
things that were reported back to me. And again, to your question about things being invisible, that isn't something that a Westerner would likely happen onto. That if I were at a border crossing, I would stick out like such a sore thumb.
Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't something I saw.
Oh, okay. I wanted to actually talk about Monica's character as well. She was a character that was very compelling for me. I think, she had that same community motivations in a way. She wanted to go back to raise her daughter. She was going to work her way out of it, kind of fight that injustice. But that unfortunately is not what happened. She was part of it, and then she went back. Her family had disowned her. Her kid had been told that she had died and then going back to the brothel, finding out that she had the disease, which um,
Mhm.
we understand to be HIV, and eventually she was kicked out of the brothel and essentially left for dead. I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe people that you spoke with and interviewed that created that character, and maybe just the perception in these spaces about sexually transmitted diseases, because it seems like there was a perceived difference within the brothel as well about having something like chlamydia, gonorrhea versus something like HIV.
Yeah. What's so tragic about the story that you just described, the idea that she was doing this for her family, the very people who sold her. She comes home having paid off her debt and they reject her. So she's forced back into the city, back into sexual slavery, and then finds out that she's HIV positive. That is unfortunately very common. One of the things I did with this anti-trafficking group was to travel to different villages in Nepal to explain here's what really happens when you send your son or your daughter off for this supposedly good job. And when they saw our bus coming, they would throw stones at us and throw manure at us because they figured we were city people and that the girls who had been in the brothels had the city disease. They were very afraid
Wow.
and rejecting of those girls.
Yeah.
And it is unfortunately true that younger girls are much more susceptible to HIV than women are, and they don't often get healthcare treatment, and they, die of the disease before they reach adulthood, and they're kicked out of the brothels. Now, there are shelters, there are organizations now that are caring for them through the end of their lives, but the men don't want to wear condoms. They don't care.
No, that
And
was going to be that was
yeah,
going to be my next question actually, is what did you see any type of protection looking like there? I mean, I would imagine little to nothing, little being the generous way of saying it, but is that kind of what you would agree with as well from your vision of
yeah.
being there?
From the interviews that I did, and also there's this kind of myth that if you have sex with if you're an older man and you've become impotent, if you have sex with a virgin, you'll be restored to your impotent, self. And obviously that's not true. And those girls are so vulnerable at that point.
Right. I guess with kind of talking about the customers and the people that go in, there were a couple mentions of white people being in the brothels. I mean, one being the rescue team that went in, staged it, "Do you need help?" But there was another man that came in and was a customer just like everybody else. Was it common for foreign men to come and be a part of this brothel, or did you hear from these experiences it was mostly community based? What did you hear on that?
So I went into a brothel that was a super cheap, down and dirty kind of place, and that is mostly local customers. And one of the sad ironies of the cyclical nature of poverty, the men who are coming to these very cheap brothel situations, they are also away from home, working as rickshaw pullers or road workers or rag pickers. They are never going to make enough money to have a home and have a family. And so they go to the brothels for sexual release or whatever you want to say it. And the cycle just continues. It's not usually wealthy tourists who are going to the kinds of brothels that I went to. Now, I included white characters in the book because I knew I was writing primarily for a US and UK based audience. And so I wanted there to be a character or two in the book that readers could identify with. And at the time, a lot of the rescue work was being done by humanitarian groups from the United States, a lot of Christian groups, a lot of ex-law enforcement groups. By the time the book came out, those groups had receded in their importance, in part because a lot of them were up to no good. Some of the Christian groups were proselytizing. They would get the girls and then try to convert them to Christianity. And so then, since then, most of the anti-trafficking work, most of the rescue work is now being done by members of the community who are much more sensitive to the needs of the community. So unfortunately, there's a way in which that white character kind of plays into the white savior stereotype, but
Hmm.
that was what was accurate at the time that I wrote the book. If I could do it again, I would change that. I also feel like sometimes it's also okay when there's something in a book that doesn't sit well with us, that is uncomfortable, that is thought-provoking, because then you can challenge it. Then you can have a classroom discussion about the white savior narrative, for instance.
No, but I think the way that you said it is actually like I completely agree with it. I think it really is a sign of the times, and I think it just shows how much change really has happened and the importance of, that community support. We have to encourage communities to uplift themselves. I mean, there's so
Right.
many factors that make that difficult, which that's a conversation for another time, of course, but I think in general, the idea of the white person coming in, throwing the kid over their back, running across the field, that's just not that's just not really one, it's not accurate anymore. And it's also there's so many problems with it because I mean I've always asked the questions, okay, that happens, but what happens next? What happens to the children? What happens to the people that are rescued, that are saved? Are they provided with support? I think sometimes they are. I think sometimes they're not. And it just goes to this funding of we got this many kids out and then they're released into the void, I guess, as I would call it, where we don't really know what happens to them after that. I mean, that happens in that case. I hear about that as well with youth that cross the border and are released into families, that sometimes they lose contact with the government, with their parents because of these different exploitative cycles. Just because you physically take someone out, if you're not assisting with stabilizing the environment around them, they're just as much of a risk for being re-trafficked, if not
Right.
worse than they were before, because now you've taken them out of an environment that was at least somewhat familiar to them in some ways.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's not to say that if you're white or if you're privileged, you st should stay out of these situations. Absolutely, the opposite is true. If we have the resources and the opportunities, it's a call to us to get involved, but to do it sensitively.
Of course, and listen to the leaders in that community because they'll always know what's the best. I think our job as people from the West, if we're going to support programs in Nepal, is to listen, as you did, listen, do the interviews, kind of come up with a way to put these stories out and use that support and the story to continue raising awareness for what's happening, but doing it in a sensitive way, of course. I mean, this makes me think of the movie The Sound of Freedom that came out in, I think it was 2022 or 2023. Stirred up a lot of commotion in the anti-trafficking community. I was actually in Guatemala when it happened. I believe, I can't remember it too well, but I believe the movie took place in Colombia, but it was
Mhm.
that white savior kind of rescue mission. And in the sector when I was working there, everyone was up in arms. They thought it was horrible. But when I was in Guatemala talking to other white travelers about it, they thought it was the best thing ever. And can you believe that this person came and he's saving these kids? And I just was thinking, like, there has to be something in the middle with this because, so many people think that this is good, and we can't say that it's not a good thing to rescue kids from that environment. But to your point, we have to do it in a sensitive and kind of culturally appropriate way and listen to the communities that are being hurt to provide that support.
Yeah, agreed.
I also we've touched on it a little bit, but I want to talk about the contrast between the harmful male figures and the helpful male figures. I found that really,
Mhm.
really compelling because, I mean, aside from Mumtaz, the people that victimized her the most were the men. From her stepfather to the man that brought her across the border to the clients, but she was also rescued by men.
Mhm.
Harish was a very kind character to her who helped her in so many ways within the book, not only helping her learn, but helping her, feel safe, being a kind of a figure. The tea boy that gave her the drink at the end, took the card. What kind of conversations did you have with the women that sparked this contrast? Because I could imagine lots of these women having very deep-seated trauma and fear of men.
Absolutely. So many of them are terrified of men. There was one woman who was rescued and they brought her back to Nepal and she ran off the airplane and hid in the grass nearby because she didn't trust anybody.
Yeah.
But I felt like it was important to have some male characters that were either benign or helpful.
Mhm.
And Harish was an important one. Also, to have some kindness, even a tiny bit of humor in this bad situation. Because as you know, even in the worst of situations, there is humor. There is a way that helps us survive.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very important to me that it not be all, very dark, dismal, hopeless. And also to show that kids come in and out of the brothels. A lot of children live in the brothels. And there he is kicking a fake soccer ball, and he's out being a little boy. She can look out the window and see him go to school
Mm-hmm.
and see him play with a ball. And she's just not that much older than he is, but she's already being, subjugated into this life of sexual slavery and oppression. And they're both kids. It was important to have there be some men, and there was even one customer who came and just wanted to hug and kiss her. He wasn't interested in having sex. He was just lonely and wanted another human body to be with. And I felt like that was important to include too. One friend of mine said, one of my a member of my writers group who was reading the manuscript as it went along said, "Are all the experiences rape? Does she ever enjoy it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, it's all rape. It's all against her will. There's no consent here." But could there be some tenderness? Okay, I'll grant you that there might be one character that would offer her a little bit of tenderness. But in the end, that just sets up more longing on her part.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, yeah, there's 2 points I have with this about her
Mhm.
reach, but regarding that character, I think it paints a very clear picture of kind of the pain that men are in when they are in a position of purchasing sex or purchasing
Mhm.
companionship or anything like that. I at least have tried to attend seminars and try to understand, okay, why do men do this? Why do they have to seek this out? And why do they go about it in such exploitative ways? And I don't find that there's a really, really clear answer, to be honest. I think there's like lots of opinions on it from professionals, from academics, from survivors, all sorts of things, even from men that have purchased sex work and talk about their experience. But I think as well, something that I just find across the board is there is that loneliness problem, whether that's I mean, I think we all know that that's not the correct way to address loneliness, but I
Mhm.
think that feeling of loneliness, that feeling of wanting companionship drives people to do lots of things that maybe they wouldn't want to do. And I felt, it's, I don't want to say I felt empathy too much for that character, but it struck that chord in me of like kind of
Sure.
what you're saying, there is some level of tenderness. People that are in this position, they don't necessarily always want to hurt somebody. They're lonely. Maybe they're using substances to cope with it that drives them further into,
Right.
purchasing sex, all of that stuff. But yeah, so I really appreciated that you included that perspective and that longing that she felt afterwards, that was the only type of tenderness that she had felt. She hadn't been held and treated in a sweet way in so long since that time happened. And, we can look at it from the outside and, as maybe a child looks at that and then gets older and understands those experiences more, it meant something to her in that time. And it meant something even more when it got taken away.
Yeah. And I think your point is a good one too, that if we demonize and continue to shame the men who participate in, let's just call it paid sex, we're never going to get to any kind of a solution here.
Hmm.
It is a commercial transaction,
Hmm. Hmm.
and supply demand. We have to work on the demand side.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, because they function off of each other, of course.
Yeah.
And again, I really appreciated Harisha's character a lot and like you said, kind of the child element of it. I mean, even in their interactions, like she would get shy and run away, or they would play and then she would still get shy and like he really was a friend to her in those spaces. And I think that tenderness is really, really important to point out as well. I also kind of and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the duality of how men were the saviors and also the perpetrators of this speaks to kind of the patriarchal aspect of that culture. Like the men were relied on kind of for that protection because women were largely disempowered within those communities. But then with that, when men were the most likely to victimize the women. I think that's with most paid sex and sexual exploitation. But I think in that case, I kind of saw that duality. Would you agree?
Definitely. And the other thing I just wanted to share was the way that things have changed since I wrote the book.
Mhm.
At the time this happened, women didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to own property. They couldn't divorce their husbands. If their children were being sold, they were really helpless to stop it. And when they started to understand that this was happening, the women organized and marched, and they have affected change. Yes, it is in large part possible because of the inequality between the sexes, but it is starting to right itself somewhat.
That actually leads exactly into what my next question was, is what kind of have you seen change within the sector from 2006, or the sector, but also the world perception of it, the space? Are there any other changes that you have noticed from then until now? It's 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is that there's so much more awareness that when you go to an airport, in the bathroom stalls, there are now signs that say, if you are being trafficked, call this number.
Mhm.
Healthcare workers, police officers, taxi drivers are being made aware that, if you see a young woman with these symptoms or this young woman being brought to a hotel by herself, if you're the cab driver, you are now educated enough to say, is this by your choice? Do you want to go here? Do you need help? So there's an awareness and a desire to help. And there's a way in which I would have said this, 20, 15 years ago, that politically, both sides of the aisle could agree that the trafficking of children was a bad thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, where you stand. There was common cause there. I would say that the bad news is that there's a lot of misinformation in the sort of the Taken movies reflection of what people think trafficking is that hasn't been that helpful.
Mhm.
And it will be very interesting for me to see what comes out of the Epstein files and the Epstein scandal and how that is addressed. Because obviously that is trafficking right here in our country by prominent people, by a huge network of enablers.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that stands out to me the most about that case. I mean, the horrific nature of what happened, but just the amount, the elites that were involved in it, and also the amount of people on that weren't at that level that had to look the other way, that had to just, that maybe aren't in the files because it was the cab driver, because it was the guy at the airport, because it was, the person that was bringing food to the hotel room. Like all these people that, were are nameless in the files have some level of accountability in that. And people are just willing to kind of look the other way. I think like to think, when I'm in my most positive mind, that's because people don't want to believe it's true. But I also think it's because these networks and these systems, there's not much accountability for it. And I think people are scared of that repercussion.
It'll be really interesting to see how this changes our view.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. There's enough social, even not from the government necessarily, but there's a lot of social pressure, I think, to have some action come from this. So I do feel positive that there will be changes, there will be accountability. Maybe not in this very moment, but I think that the push for it won't stop. I guess now we're talking all about the politics. It's a good time to jump into the last section, the
Mhm,
banned books.
mhm,
So
mhm.
as I mentioned before, Sold was mentioned by PEN America as the third most commonly challenged book in the entire US in 2025. It is challenged in multiple states, libraries, school boards, by groups like Liberty for Moms, different school districts, people that aren't even a member of the school district actually raising this in the boards. That was something I found, one of the many things about that I found crazy. But I just kind of want to know a little bit about your perspective on it. I think the people that listen to this podcast, they're very aware that I'm a I am not in support of the banned books. I think even if you choose for your child not to read that, that should not be limited for other people. And you have to engage with the material to have that critical awareness of what is age appropriate, what isn't. I mean, this story is about a 13-year-old girl who's a child, and that's the reality that children are facing around the world. So, that was just my perspective. I want to hear yours. So, starting off, what was your reaction to hearing this book is being challenged both in school districts and public libraries in multiple states?
It's really heartbreaking for so many reasons. As an author, it's not about me one iota. It's about the girls who sat for those interviews. It's about those NGOs who hooked me up and got me into the brothels and snuck me into the jail. And the people who are doing this work. It is so profoundly disrespectful to people who put themselves on the line to get the story told.
Mm-hmm.
It's also disrespectful to young readers. It's like saying, we don't think you can handle this. And I do understand. I think there are two kinds of people in the world of challenging books. There are people who don't want their own kids to read these books. Okay, as you said, you nailed it by saying you need to read it yourself critically, and then you have a right as a parent to try, and I do use the word try because good luck trying to ban a book from a curious teenager.
You tell them no, they're just going to want it more.
Right. You can try to control what your teenager is going to read, but you have no right to control what the rest of the community is reading. And this is not a book that kids are drawn to because they're going to learn about sex. The kids who are picking this book up are activists, are curious, or they have some victimization in their own lives. And they're picking this book up because it tells a version of their story. So when I go to classrooms, invariably, a student will come up to me afterward or will stand up in front of her peers and say something like, "This has happened in my life." And they're able to get help. Not necessarily that they've been trafficked, but that an uncle is abusing them or something like that. There's something about a story that's not your story. It's 7 degrees over here, but it's similar to your story that allows you to see yourself and ask for help. It's also really disrespectful to the kids who would want to become activists and to say, we're going to take this out of your hands. Well, how then do they develop empathy? How then do they develop an awareness of an understanding of what their peers are experiencing? And the privileged and the activist ones who would want to get involved don't have that opportunity. You know, parents will say, well, we wish this wasn't true. And I agree, I wish it wasn't true too.
Right.
But by depriving a student of the chance to read about it, you're not protecting them. You're actually making them more vulnerable. They need to understand the world as it is, not necessarily as we want it to be. You're depriving them of the chance to, as I say, develop empathy and to be part of the solution.
Of course. Well, and I think kind of tying it back to what you said earlier about being worldly, like you can't just shut your eyes and pretend that these things aren't happening. And I think obviously there's some sensitivity with it, but if you introduce these topics to children when they're younger and maybe age appropriate ways, by the time that they're older, they have a deeper understanding of these things, these systems, and they can grow up wanting to do something about it by shutting it down and not just shutting it down for your child, but for the public, trying to remove it from schools. Like you said, you're depriving everybody from that opportunity to learn about it, to relate it to their experience. I think what you said about the, 7 steps away or the separation of it is very, very true. People can't always process an experience when it happens to them right away, especially if you're a child. You grow
Yeah.
up in an environment, you've faced violence, sexual violence, physical violence. You're not going to necessarily know that that's wrong unless something is presented to you that shows it that way. And so if you're not presenting that to children, it just normalizes that behavior and it doesn't give them that perspective to know when something's harming me or even when something's harming someone else.
That's absolutely true. And to your other point, too, about some of these people aren't even parents, there are people who have a right, if they have children in that school system, to be involved in what's going on in their school. The majority are not parents. They'll take a page from the book. There's a website where you can, if you want a challenge sold, you read page, I forget what it is, page 123. You stand up at your school board meeting and you read it and you say, this is pornography and our students shouldn't read it. And it's so out of context. Yes, this is a book about trafficking. Of course, there has to be a scene in which this young girl is raped.
Yeah.
But it is written, I'm so aware that I'm writing for children, for other people's children. There's no graphic language. It's more about how bewildered and how afraid and how confused and how physically painful this is. This isn't pornography. If you think that's pornography, you really have a problem.
Well, and it's so
Um,
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just it upsets me when I hear that as well because it's so disrespectful to these stories of people that have experienced assault to say it's pornography, to present it as anything like that. And that's even another story about the whole pornography of it all. But like
yeah,
it astounds me because when I was researching it, that was what I kept finding is, sexual content
content. Yeah.
pornography, things like that. And I was like, no, come on, there must be someone who had some logical reason for wanting their children not to read it. And nothing. I couldn't find anything. It was all just these absurd, it was almost sexualization of this story, entirely
Yeah.
about vulnerability. Yeah.
I like to, whenever the book is challenged, I like to engage with the people who are mounting the challenge. So I've dealt with Moms for Liberty on a number of occasions
Wow.
because I feel like if they're just over there screaming about the book and I'm over here trying to defend it, we're not talking to each other. We're not going to get anywhere. So I call them. And most of the time they don't want to talk. I think that they don't want to come face to face with me. Maybe they think I'm big and scary, but when we have engaged, they have admitted to me that no, it really isn't pornographic. And yes, it has literary merit. And yes, it has merit in terms of making kids aware. But there's some kind of twisted, there's a way in which they're using the book as a stalking horse for an agenda that really isn't about the book. One of the Moms for Liberty said to me, when girls read these stories about unpleasant sexual encounters with men, it makes them want to be gay. It's like, okay, we can agree on certain things. Like we're both against the sexualization of children.
Yeah.
We can find common cause here,
Yes.
but I can't go there. That
No.
isn't
No, but
rational
you're
to
no,
me.
exactly. You're not talking to somebody. That's again, that's them putting their own agenda, like you said, on the story in a way that that would not have even occurred to me, to be honest. I don't know what I was expecting you to say, but definitely not that. That's
Not that.
crazy to hear. I mean, yeah, but I think the nature of these bands, like you said, it is to support the agenda. And they probably, I would imagine, or don't want to talk to you because you will be rational about it. You'll explain what the story's about, and it makes the agenda fall apart. That's what I would imagine.
I went to a library in Alabama where they had their funding yanked because they wouldn't remove the book.
Yeah.
And Moms for Liberty were there. And I said, is there anybody in the audience who was part of this challenge? I'd like to hear from you. It's easy to be a bully and stand up at the school board meeting and shake your fist and read one passage and then go away. It's much harder to stay and engage in a conversation.
Well, and I would imagine probably it's because they haven't actually read the book. They can't really say much. If all they can quote is page 123, the argument kind of falls flat. At least read it. Whatever opinion you're going to have after, read it. You can read it before your kids read it. You can read it and then talk to the school. Do something about it at least for yourself, because if you just kind of take what's being presented, you're not critically thinking about it. And I mean, I think that's one of the pitfalls with all the censorship stuff is its aim is to prevent people from being critical about literature. Like you said, even with the white savior complex in the story, you can think it's bad, you can think it's good, you can think maybe it's something in the middle, but if you're not engaging with it, it becomes really hard to have an opinion on it.
Yeah, agreed. It's really a shame that it shuts down that kind of access and that kind of curiosity. But there are incredible things that are being done for workarounds. There's a ebook company that any place where the book has been banned, they will make the ebook copies available for free. Pretty clever.
Wow.
People are standing up at school board meetings. There was one dad in Pennsylvania who said, this book broke my heart. I have a daughter. To think about a child of mine being trafficked. He said he cried all through the book, but he believes that the book still needs to be in the classroom.
Yeah, that's a very moving statement. And I mean, it just speaks to why these books need to be read. People need to be exposed to that. People need to be moved by these stories, and understand that these things are happening. And when you hear about injustices happening like that, it makes you want to act. It makes you want to be involved. I think a lot of people feel that way. I think sometimes the narrative, at least in the media, different communities, when these different agendas come into play, they maybe will go past that first initial instinct to kind of follow what the masses, the agenda, or even their localized community will say. I guess kind of my final question on the book ban is what role should literature play in exposing difficult realities? What role do you think it has?
I think it's a very important role. Books are more carefully developed and fact-checked and checked for sensitivity, all the many, many hurdles a book has to go through, all the editors who look at a book and try to make sure that it's as good as it can possibly be. that that's a much safer place than anything else you're going to find on the internet, for instance, about any topic that you care about.
Mhm.
So I believe that books are sturdy. A book is a private thing. You can, if you need to find out about trafficking, if you need to find out about sexual abuse, if you need to find out about sexual identity, whatever, a book is a private place
Yeah.
where you can engage kind of one-on-one with the material in front of you safely, and as I said, privately, but with that feeling of integrity and respect. And then you can take it out in public. And then you can talk to your mom or your dad or your teacher or what have you. But I just think to deprive kids of that opportunity to either be comforted or be challenged is there. It's their opportunity. Those are the kinds of citizens we want to grow.
Of course, of course. No, that's perfectly said, and I couldn't agree more. I do want to ask one of the questions that one of the book club members sent. This kind of refers to the story itself. So they wrote, the details about Coca-Cola as a rare luxury stand
Yes.
out. Did this come directly from survivor accounts? And what other moments from your interviews surprised you? I liked that as well. It was something that I
Yeah,
found, but I wouldn't have necessarily thought to ask. So I'm happy that they did.
yeah. That came from direct experience. I was this kind of outsider visiting these little villages, and they knew that if I drank the water, that I might get sick. They would buy me Coca-Cola. I would hate it because it was a huge expense, like relatively huge expense for me
Mhm.
on their part for my
Yeah,
benefit. And so that's kind of where I got that.
yeah.
And it's also the ultimate American export, is it
Totally.
not?
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
totally. Well, and I think as well, it really highlights the way that it is just such a commonly drinking product in the States. I mean, in the UK, like I mean, I've got a bottle over there right now, and it's maybe 1 pound or something like that. But what did she say at one point that the cost of her was the same price as a Coca-Cola bottle, and that was very, very moving to hear. And I think, yeah, it shows
Yeah.
that it is a luxury there, and the luxuries that we take so quickly for granted.
Right. I wanted to show that. And as you said, the cost of a sexual transaction is about the cost of a Coca-Cola or a burger at McDonald's. It's important to, since they are being treated as commodities, to tell you as a reader what the scale is.
Right, right. No, totally, totally. Yeah, I really appreciated that metaphor as well. I think it illustrated perfectly the juxtaposition of we're all in the same world, but we have such different realities that we're all in. And I think I'll just ask you one more if you don't mind.
Okay.
Did you ever consider alternative endings, or did you always intend for the story to close on a hopeful note?
I'm so glad that somebody asked that. I wrote 60 more pages where she gets out, she gets a clean HIV test, she gets a bath, she burns her clothes from the brothel, she starts to find her way home. And my editor said, no, you have to end it just here where she's taking that first step toward her own freedom.
Hmm.
And that'll keep people wondering, well, what happened? How did it work out? That if you take care of all the loose ends, if you tie it all up in a bow, people aren't left to engage their own imaginations, their own intellect in the story. Kids hate this ending, but
Yeah.
when I explain why it was done that way, they get it. And I often, when I go to schools, ask the kids, okay, here, you write your own ending.
Wow.
Give me a page and a half about what you think happened.
And what would you say they usually would write?
A lot of the kids, it kind of tends to break down on gender lines. A lot of the boys have somebody come in with a machine gun and kill Mumtaz.
Of
And
course.
they're angry. And I think
Yeah.
it's an expression of righteous fury and some version of justice in their heads. A
Yeah.
lot of the girls are like, she goes back home, and the boy that she loved understands that this happened to her against her will, and they get back together again. Or the mother comes and finds her, or the stepfather says he's sorry. We all need a resolution.
Hmm. That's very sweet, and I definitely can imagine the boys writing the machine gun stories or the girls writing the happy endings in that way. That's very, very sweet. And I think that's a great exercise as well to give people the opportunity. Okay, where do you see this going? When you hear about this, what do you think happens next? And but I'm also it's really interesting to hear that you left out that section of the book. I think after you read it, you kind of understand that maybe she doesn't know. Maybe there isn't quite a clear-cut answer as to what happens next.
It would be too cheap for me to write a completely happy ending. That just isn't truthful. As you know, the movie has a different ending,
Yeah.
and I cry every single time. I don't know how many times I've seen it. I still cry because
Yeah,
it is more hopeful and more sentimental. And I think after a movie, you kind of need that. You're kind
right.
of beat up in the movie.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I think actually hearing now your ending and hearing it with the story, they actually were pretty aligned in that way, with the burning of the clothes and at the end that
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much for
Oh, thank
speaking.
you.
I do have one kind of last question to wrap this all up. If Lakshmi could speak to the readers directly, what do you think she would want them to hear?
That's a beautiful question. And I think it is see me. I think one of the biggest pains of any kind of a trauma is that sense of isolation and the sense that nobody understands what I'm going through. And the idea that you become invisible
Mhm.
is so painful. So I think it's just please witness what has happened to me.
Hmm. Thank you for portraying this story and Lakshmi in such a beautiful and sensitive way. I think I was very inspired by her resilience. And as I said, as someone who's worked in the sector and has awareness of these different vulnerabilities, the stories of real people that experience that, I think you did it in a very tasteful way that was very accurate. You could definitely tell that there was so much research and thought and care that went into portraying these stories. And I really I hate when I'm like, oh, I loved reading it, but I did love reading it. It's a heavy story, but
Oh,
I loved reading it. I found it very moving. There were parts when I cried, there were parts when I smiled, there were parts
yeah.
when I felt rage, much like the little boys did in those classes. So thank you for sharing that story out there. And thank you as well for coming to speak with me and for
Oh,
sharing
my
your
pleasure.
thoughts and answering the questions for the book club. I know everyone's going to be so excited to hear it. Yeah. So I think
Thank you. What a great conversation it was. And thank you for your response to the book. That's what I would dream of, that
oh,
it's a challenging read, but it moves you.
yeah. Well, and I think that's what I definitely felt. That's what the other readers in our group felt. Yeah, your book has been very impactful.